Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the latest edition of the TIDES Expert Opinion Series. My name is Michael Dunnett from the TIDES team. I'm joined here by a couple of members of Sartorius BIA Separations today. Rok Sekirnik, Head of Process Development for mRNA and pDNA, and Thomas Kostelec, Technology and Business Development Manager. Welcome to you both. And I will now hand over to Rok for the presentation.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a real pleasure to be able to take you through some aspects. We cannot possibly cover all in 30 minutes, but we'll do our best to zoom through all of the different aspects of chromatography as useful and used in an mRNA production process. By way of short introduction, so Sartorius BIA Separations is a company fully owned by Sartorius, located in Slovenia, and we focus on development and utilization of Monolith chromatographic technology, and are focusing heavily on mRNA processes. And in the next 30 minutes, I would like to cover with you at least the following subjects. First, the underpinning concept of mRNA structure and properties as useful for both analytical and preparative development. I would like to spend quite some time on utilizing chromatography in a clever way to increase productivity of the most expensive part of the mRNA production process, that is the IVT reaction, the in vitro transcription reaction, and how we can make it both faster and yield more RNA by looking into it in near real time with chromatography. And in the second part of the talk, I would like to then spend time on trying to purify out just the target mRNA using a variety of approaches, from affinity, multimodal chromatography to reverse phase to remove double-stranded RNA. So, at the bottom of it all is chemistry, the biochemistry of mRNA, which needs to underpin all of our, let's say, CMC and analytical process development activities. And when we consider the mRNA as a biological structure, we realize it's, I think, fair to say, quite unlike any other biopharmaceutical modalities. First thing that's probably typically overlooked is that it's a huge biopharmaceutical molecule. It's at least 3 to 4 times larger than a typical monoclonal antibody, which has thus far been considered a relatively large biomolecule. And now we're talking molecular size in megadaltons. So nearly tenfold greater order of size compared to the previously considered large biopharmaceuticals, bringing with them challenges and opportunities for selective purification and analytics. Another aspect that's very useful when developing processes and analytical strategies is that it's a relatively highly charged molecule. We often consider it's a negatively charged molecule because of the phosphates, but we don't appreciate just how acidic this molecule is. And that brings with it a whole host of, again, opportunities for selective purification and isolation, as well as, of course, challenges. And also, perhaps an underappreciated aspect of mRNA or RNA biochemistry is that it's relatively hydrophobic, and that the hydrophobicity can be teased out of it if treated in an appropriate way, in particular in presence of high concentrations of salt, such as sodium chloride or so. We can actually tease out a lot of the hydrophobic properties of RNA, and again use them either for analytics or purification. And of course, one of the major features, one most commonly known features of mRNA, particular of mature mRNA, is of course the poly-A tail, which again lends itself as a super useful tool when we try to selectively capture the mRNA out of a mixture of other contaminants or building blocks, or if you want, IVT reaction components. One aspect that is joined with that, and it also applies to the broader mRNA biochemistry, is tertiary structure. And we're, I think, only starting to appreciate the complexity of the RNA three-dimensional structure. So it's not a linear chain. It's a highly complex, highly structured molecule, which I think we're only beginning to start to understand. We're beginning to use these modeling tools to predict the structure. And one interesting feature that we typically find is that whenever we engineer poly-A tails to these structures, the poly-A tail seems to have no secondary structure. It always seems to be floating relatively freely and not making any binding interactions with other nucleotides in the chain. So that makes it both a useful feature of the sequence. Affinity capture of poly-A tail is relatively easy, but also reminds us just how complex the rest of the structure is and how much there is to learn. So that is just a teaser, and the EGFP standard mRNA sequence modeled with minimum free energy prediction tool. If it's right or not, I think it's quite difficult to say. So, taking all of these features together, so large, highly charged, mildly hydrophobic, and most often with an engineered poly-A tail, we need to think about how we can now use these properties to our advantage when we try to purify highly pure mRNA drug substance. And one aspect that is becoming ever more apparent is that traditional chromatographic approaches break down when we deal with megadalton large biomolecules. And so we need to apply different chromatographic approaches from what we were perhaps still trained on in our biochemistry lessons. So the porous particle approach simply does not yield much RNA compared to what alternative approaches based on convective mass transfer, such as Monolith, can offer. And perhaps this is one homing slide on that underpins the rest of the presentation. I do want to spend just a second on what the Monolith structure is and why it lends itself as such a useful purification analytical tool. Namely, if these were three porous particles there joined together, they are highly porous on the surface, but the size of one of these pores is actually much smaller compared to the size of an mRNA molecule, and the properties, the flow properties of the mobile phase that flows here between those particles exerts high turbulence. mRNA, we're learning, is a highly shear-sensitive molecule, and this can be so apart from not actually binding the mRNA into the pores of the porous particle, the flow properties of the mobile phase actually lead to at least partial degradation of the molecule. The alternative approach, the opposite idea to porous particle, is that there is no high porosity particles as such in a chromatographic unit, but rather the chromatographic unit is engineered with interconnected flow channels that are much larger than the size of an mRNA molecule, and the size of the channels are functionalized with a suitable ligand chemistry, so that first of all, the mRNA doesn't have to enter into any pores that would be too small. The channel size is large enough because of the particular flow characteristics of mobile phase running through a monolith structure. The so-called mass transfer is convective rather than diffusive, meaning that we do not lose binding properties by increasing flow rate, and shear forces operate with minimal effects. Shear forces are absolutely minimized here. to illustrate this point better, perhaps with this slide. So this is the flow properties of mobile phase carrying our mRNA throughout the structure of a monolith. And if we imagine that this is a wall, which is highly functionalized with ligands, be it affinity ligands or ion exchange ligands or hydrophobic ligands, the mRNA just binds as it travels through the channels. It doesn't have to diffuse anywhere into a pore. So if this is now, again, a porous particle, RNA would have to very slowly diffuse into a pore and then diffuse out, and diffusion, as we know, becomes slower and slower as the molecular size increases to the point where it's absolutely a constraint by the time we come to a size of molecule, the size of mRNA. So with that, we're seeing this, and the reports are more and more frequent on the fact that porous particle chromatography isn't the best approach anymore for RNA, for mRNA, and we see that the adoption of convective interaction chromatographic media, which will underpin now the rest of the story and how we can actually utilize now its many advantages for analytics and purification of mRNA. The two main advantages that convective interaction media bring to mRNA game is flow-independent resolution and binding capacity, and laminar flow, which leads to low shear. And we'll see now how this can be made useful in analytics. I'll say one sentence or so about our concept of the purification process for mRNA drug substance. And then I will actually focus more on three key points thereof. So when we think about an mRNA production process, for us, it really starts already the fermentation of typically of E. coli producing the plasmid that is used as a template for mRNA production. So the E. coli has to grow in fermenters, undergo a relatively complex process, technically challenging process of alkaline lysis, which needs consideration during scale-up, and after filtration steps to remove cellular debris, we can capture the plasmid DNA in its supercoiled form, linearize it with a restriction enzyme, purify out the enzyme and endotoxin and any other cellular contaminants deriving from E. coli, buffer exchange it to make the most important raw material for mRNA production, which is linear plasmid. Linear plasmid is then taken into in vitro transcription reaction, which I will say a lot more in the next few minutes, before RNA can then be purified out of the IVT mixture with a whole host of different approaches. The one that we like a lot is affinity purification, targeting the poly A tail of the mRNA, followed by some sort of chromatography, which is either based on hydrophobic interaction chromatography, reverse phase chromatography, or other. And then typically we need to perform buffer exchange to formulate the drug substance in the final drug substance storage buffer and sterile filter it by the time we came to our mRNA drug substance. And I will not touch upon formulation into lipid nanoparticles today. So that's the process. You already see some hints at chromatography as used in the entire process. I will not touch upon the plasmid part today for the sake of time, but only on the mRNA side. And so where can we reasonably and usefully apply chromatography? In multiple aspects, chromatography is already routinely applied, and in some aspects, we are still engaging and proposing the community to apply chromatography more to both get better understanding of the process, higher purity of the product. So at the stage of raw material control, I think there's no doubt that chromatography is used extensively to monitor the purity of the ingredients, plasmids, NTPs, quality and capping reagents and enzymes. I will not talk much about that. The new aspect that I'm proposing today is to get a much better understanding of the IVT reaction by applying chromatography, and then to understand the stage at which the IVT reaction is from the point of view of mRNA content, but also NTP content, capping reagent content. And then with other approaches, we can also monitor double-strand content and other impurities. Of course, as I already mentioned, chromatography is exceedingly useful for purification, either as capture or polish step, and then as an in-process analytical tool. And here I'll mention PASIX system as a mRNA designed HPLC system with embedded softwares to support really top-end in-process analytics to monitor both the mRNA content and purity throughout the entire process. And we can, of course, use chromatography as drug substance analytical tools and as a stability indicating tools. With my colleague Tomas, who's in this webinar as well today, we published a short piece in BPI summarizing some of these concepts back in December 2021, which I invite you to read offline. So the core, at the heart of mRNA production process is the IVT reaction, the in vitro transcription reaction, which turns a linear plasmid into mRNA. It's a highly complex reaction, and these are some of the components typically used. There are others that the community is now proposing, but the basics is a polymerase, NTPs, magnesium, pyrophosphatase, typically RNase inhibitor, often spermidine, often DTC, sometimes capping reagent. So we have to get all of these components right to have a high yielding process. How do we do that? Typically or traditionally, if IVT productivity has been measured, it was measured by ribogreen, by fluorescent method, cumbersome, with matrix interference effects, operating relatively slow and low throughput. What we are proposing is a twofold approach, and you can decide for pros and cons of each, but one is the concept of protein A-like approach. So in MAB world, the protein A analytical chromatography is used to titer monoclonal antibodies. For polyadenylated mRNA, the same is possible with oligo-DT analytical column. So one parameter at a time, it's a rapid method, few minutes, that titers polyadenylated mRNA as a single peak. And that's very useful to keep an eye on the content of mRNA throughout the process. What we've worked hard to develop is a very short multi-attribute method that in a gradient separation time of approximately 3 minutes gives a lot more information than just the content of polyadenylated RNA. It's a complementary method, but we believe a lot more informative because it separates out in the space of 3 minutes mRNA, or really any RNA. This could also be circular RNA, could be saRNA, could be any other RNA species, from plasmid, from nucleotide triphosphate, from capping reagents. And this is, of course, an example of standards injected. So ARCA, for example, separates completely from all the other peaks. CleanCap AG separated from all NTP peaks, and so forth. So you can use this method to simultaneously measure the content of any of these ingredients if you have them in the IVT reaction. And you can imagine how this becomes very useful to keep an eye on the status of the IVT reaction. So the most basic experiment that can be run is to sample the IVT reaction at a defined interval and measure the RNA as it is formed and NTPs as they're consumed. If you have a capping reagent in the reaction, ARCA or CleanCap, this is expected to decrease a little bit, but not as significantly as NTPs. And so you can plot the areas under the curve, and you start seeing an increase in RNA and a decrease in NTP concentration. At least we know how quickly RNA is produced, and we also quite quickly see what is slowing our reaction down. In this particular case, we can see the reaction stopped by the time that we depleted ATP. And so we can now run optimization of our IVT reaction, and because it's a really rapid method, we can run these optimizations in a matter of hours or days. And so we can start really playing with the IVT reaction, and this is one of my favorite slides because it shows how we can actually start really playing with the kinetics of IVT reaction. So for example, here it took us a while to realize that the temperature was off in the reaction. So before the temperature was corrected, then mRNA production really started. And we see that if the entity is unconsumed, the mRNA isn't produced. We then applied this experiment number 1. And experiment number 2, we actually managed to stop the reaction at this point and then start it again in an hour's time. And we see again the NTPs were not consumed for an hour, and RNA wasn't produced for an hour. And when we decided it's time for the reaction to start again, we could kick it off. The NTPs were consumed and the mRNA started to be produced again. We did this as a proof of point that we can really see what goes on in the reaction, not that you want to do this as part of the process, and so forth, all the way up to having a nice batch IVT reaction producing, in the region of 8 to even 10 grams per liter. You can really see what factors affect the yield of the reaction. Of course, this can be done with a quaternary HPLC system, but we also offer let's say, plug-and-play solution, a HPLC system with embedded chromatographic methods and analysis software that takes operators through all of the steps needed to prepare samples, buffers, and so forth. And we call this the PATFIX system. Why is the PATFIX system a very good idea to have in a development, and we actually propose even in a production suite, because we can keep an eye on the reaction as it goes on. Is the pinnacle, is the definition of IPC analytics. I will now make a slight detour to add another attribute to the RNA before coming back to optimizing the IVT reaction. Namely, if we apply a selective digestion method like exonuclease, which digests only uncapped RNA, and monitor the content of RNA before and after nuclease treatment, we can actually estimate the percent of capping. So by using identical method as described earlier, just add an exonuclease treatment step, we can now also estimate or quantify how much capped or uncapped RNA we have in our sample. So for example, we did this to an uncapped RNA, and we see that with nuclease it was completely digested. Without nuclease it wasn't. We then purchased some CleanCap AG capped RNA and could see that there was absolutely no digestion of RNA. We could quantify the capping as being 95% plus minus a few percent deviation. So we can now keep an eye on the capping as one of the critical quality attributes of mRNA, literally with one analytical setup. The next obvious thing to do then is to further increase the productivity. We saw NTP consumption is limiting our production of mRNA. How are we going to feed in the building blocks, the NTPs? Not really possible without keeping an eye on the NTP consumption, and the NTP consumption should be monitored in near real time. So by using the same analytical method that we apply on our PATFIX HPLC system, you can now keep track with only 3 to 5 minute lag time of where the NTP content is, and so you can start feeding them back into the reaction and keep the reaction going for much longer, thereby increasing the overall productivity of the reaction. You don't have to add any additional T7, which is the expensive part. The only The only additional cost is the cost of NTPs. So we calculate that doing the reaction this way actually decreases the COGS by up to 50% by some calculations. You can do this feed addition manually, or you can automate it. And if you have a bioreactor that can, in an automated fashion, add feeds like Amber 250, you can actually automatize this, and we have done exactly the same experiment in Amber 250. Instead of feeding bolus additions of NTPs, Amber 250 did this for us, and we could show that we reached a nice continuous increase in RNA mass rather than just the concentration. Concentration tends to cap at about 10 to maximum 12 mg per mil, but the reaction was continuously going until, in theory, until you reach the maximum volume of the vessel. So this is then a nice way to really increase the productivity of the reaction. I make a very short pause here because the next section then deals with how to purify out the mRNA out of this reaction. And like I mentioned, we now need to make use of the many features of RNA. The first one is polyadenylation. Oligo-DT is so standardized in the mRNA community that I will not mention it other than by name. It's a bind-elute method, works very well. Elution peaks are with a monolith very concentrated, so it doesn't only purify out the RNA, also concentrates it, typically to just around 1 mg per mil in water. So it's very useful matrix for further downstream steps. We have published recently on how to reach dynamic binding capacities of upwards of 5 mg per mil. We reached even 6 mg per mil. We identified that guanidine as a stronger chaotrope than sodium chloride can increase dynamic binding capacity from, let's say, a standard of 3 to 4 mg per mil up to 5 to 6 mg per mil binding capacity. We've shown this in 96-well format, which is available with oligo-DT resin, and scaled it up to a larger size Monolith. We've also shown, and there's a reference to the publication here in the slide, that purifying RNA by chromatography actually stabilizes it long-term, or at least prevents or removes factors that would lead to degradation of RNA over time. And we've shown that by purifying RNA by oligo-DT, the RNA is stable at 37 degrees for up to a month, whereas if you apply precipitation techniques, the quality of RNA quickly degrades. We've shown this with multiple methods and repeated this multiple times, and are now also getting feedback from the world that they see the same. And I want to actually now throw in just one more extension of the oligo-DT work, namely oligo-DT is just one type of ligand that we can immobilize. That's an affinity ligand. We can immobilize literally any designed affinity ligand, and for sake of concept, we've immobilized an oligo-DT ligand and put an oligo, a poly C tail on the RNA for sake of illustration that we can develop now completely customized ligands to RNA features of your choice. So really imagination is now the limit. We show that, at least in case of oligo-DG ligands, you can capture RNA that's polycitidinated. We can make an oligo DA ligand. We can make customized oligo ligands. Sky's the limit, and we are here to support our customers with specific ligand designs. More common is multimodal purification, and here quite a popular ligand is so-called prima S ligand, which is a mixed mode ion exchanger hydrogen bonding ligand. And here we show that we have high specificity for RNA, whether polyadenylated or not, that we can capture out of the IVT reaction. because of the ion exchange, hydrogen bonding interactions. The elution here is typically performed with a pH gradient, and we've shown the pH required for elution from this ligand is 10.5, and this sometimes raises some questions about the quality of RNA in the elution, and so we've run a stability test, in this case on EBFP, but we've done it on others as well, which shows that if eluate from prima S is neutralized, the RNA is stable again at 37 degrees for at least a month. So that's so we conclude that even a short-term pH excursion for elution from such a ligand is not problematic from the point of view of RNA stability, but neutralization step is needed. And because we are never stopping in thinking about new ligands and new designs and better ways of capturing RNA, we're currently working on some prototype ligands with a PI of approximately 5.5, which we already show can actually bind the RNA out of the IVT mixture and elute it at pH 7.5. And we think that that's probably one of the next breakthroughs in the RNA purification world. We have prototypes available and are available for beta testing. We've shown that selectivity is high, recovery of 90% at pH 7.5 without the need to rely on polyadenylation or any kind of selective ligand interaction. And I conclude with one mention, at least, of double-stranded RNA as one of the headache-inducing impurities. Double-stranded RNA can be purified typically on the basis of its difference in hydrophobicity compared to single-stranded RNA. We see larger, meaning 3' extended double-stranded RNA structures. We sometimes encounter shorter fragments. We can reliably remove double-stranded RNA with reverse phase chromatography. In our case, Monolith based on styrene divinyl benzene ligand. So it's a phenyl backbone ligand that can very reliably remove double strand in presence of acetonitrile and ion pairing agent, either at room temperature, so it works nicely at room temperature, or sometimes also performed at elevated temperatures. But we actually showed that room temperature separation is completely feasible. And we are still working also on other modes of separating double-stranded RNA that would be also performed in aqueous media. So that was a zoom through all of the various ways that we see chromatography as being useful in mRNA production process, either as analytical tools, and we show that because of their high flow rates that monoliths can achieve, they can be really high resolution tools to look into the guts of the IVT reaction. And I remind us here of this Prima S, analytical Prima S tool to monitor the IVT. It can be extended to monitor capping efficiency, and then to purify out the mRNA from the IVT mixture. I've shown examples of affinity ligands, mostly based on oligo-DT. I've also shown that you can immobilize any ligand of choice to target a specific RNA sequence. And I've also shown some multimodal capture opportunities based either on Prima S or a prototype Prima H, as well as the polishing out of double strand that's typically performed with reverse phase chromatography. I think that brings me 3 minutes over time, but I'm glad that we could run through this process together. Our goal is to help and intensify the processes, make them high yielding, high purity. We are never stopping to strive to develop next generation processes. So we're very happy to hear from you. And I think we have a few minutes now for questions. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Rok, for sharing this presentation with us. So you've shown multiple tools for analytics and purification of mRNA, and we already have some fantastic questions from the audience. Before we proceed, I will again invite everyone to submit your questions through the webinar platform so they can be answered by our speaker. The questions are not visible to the audience, and if any question is not answered during this webinar, we will address them later on by email. So without further ado, I will start with the first question, which is there a difference between the analytical PRIMA-S method we've seen and the purification column? And how do you use each of these two different methods?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So there's a similarity, and the similarity is the column chemistry. So the PRIMA-S ligand is the same for analytical application as it is for the purification, but the gradient separation is different. So the pH gradient, which we use for the purification of RNA out of the IVT mixture for preparative purposes, is not the same gradient as we would use for analytical separation of NTPs. For analytical separation of NTPs, we use a pyrophosphate gradient, which gives us superior resolution between NTPs and capping reagent and plasmid and mRNA. For preparative purification, this resolution is not so important, but rather the fact that we can selectively capture out the RNA. So a pH gradient turns out to be a better approach.
All right, thank you so much. And the next question is, are you managing to separate between double-stranded mRNA and single-stranded mRNA?
Yes, that's the million-dollar question. We show that in the largest majority of cases that we receive for analytical or preparative separation of single-stranded and double-stranded RNA, we are able to do that. And I go back to the slide where I've shown this. So by looking at dot plot of fractions eluting from the SDVB column, we can show that the fractions eluting after the single-stranded RNA peak show a high intensity signal by dot plot, suggesting presence of relatively higher amount of double-stranded RNA, whereas now this main elution peak does not show a signal on dot plot, suggesting that we have successfully removed double-stranded RNA from that majority of the elution peak.
Fantastic, thank you so much. The next question is, and I believe this was answered, but do you see any degradation of RNA during high pH elution from the PRIMA-S column?
So we have spent extensive time looking at stability of RNA at various pHs, and it is a fact that RNA does not like pH of 7 and above. So actually, we strongly recommend that RNA is never stored at a longer term stored at a pH above 6, maximum 6.5. So already at pH 7, 7.2, you will start seeing slow degradation, and the degradation kinetics will increase with each pH unit increase. So when we developed the PRIMA-S purification method, we were fully aware of the fact that if we leave the RNA at high pH for prolonged periods of time, we would see degradation. So we engineered an immediate neutralization step directly upon elution from PRIMA-S. So we neutralize to a mildly acidic pH. So the RNA is not exposed to a pH excursion for more than 30 to 60 seconds. And there we show that the RNA purified in this way is stable at 37 degrees for at least 1 month.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you again, yes.
Perfect. The next question is, hello, do you suggest any method for protein clearance from mRNA samples?
Yeah, protein. So the easiest approach, so oligo-DT, so affinity purification will already do the majority of protein clearance. In unlikely event that there is still residual protein after oligo-DT, typically a hydrophobic interaction chromatography, so HIC approach is very reliable at removing residual protein. This would be, for example, a C4 butyl ligand operated under HIC conditions would be my recommendation.
Thank you. And the next question is, what's the impact of the fed batch approach or continuous mode on the level of impurities in the product?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were particularly looking at double-strand RNA, which we did not see an increased emergence of. And the RNA quality seemed to remain stable throughout the process. And there are, as far as I understand, actually double-stranded RNA production, for example, is anyway fastest in the early part of the IVT reaction. But once the polymerase is going, the production of double-strand RNA decreases anyway. So if you just keep the reaction going, you're unlikely to produce more double-stranded RNA compared to performing it in batch. So the way we think about it is really just prevent the running out of the building blocks of the NTPs, whereas the T7 polymerase acts as normal. We have done this on a few sample model mRNAs. We're about to see a publication of this, and we hope that the world will test this approach on a variety of other constructs.
All right, thank you for that. The next question is, what is the rough size of the largest RNA molecule separated in analytical application?
So in analytical application, it's a question that can be answered in multiple ways. When we apply prima S analytical chromatography to monitor the production, that method doesn't distinguish between size of RNA. So a 1000 nucleotide EGFP will behave just the same as a self-amplifying construct. We'll just quantify the total amount of RNA in the sample. Where we do separate RNAs by size is in reverse phase chromatography. And there, I think we have successfully separated 10,000 nucleotide RNA from smaller fragments, although it's true that the resolution slowly decreases as the molecular size increases. I don't have the data here at hand, but feel free to reach out to us and we can talk about specifics.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. And so the question would be, can you comment on the type of ligands that you use in the resin for separation?
So it's a relatively general question, which I would answer by saying that we really consider the chemistry of RNA in a particular environment. So if we take the acidic nature of RNA, then we work with these ion exchanges with hydrogen bonding elements of prima S. Or if we consider RNA in a much more hydrophobic context, then we go to hydrophobic interaction chromatography. And I'm not sure if this answers the question, but we can tweak the matrix and then the ligand. So the ligand and the matrix in which the RNA are found are key to get the best separation, of course, depending on what is the critical impurity that we try to remove. So we always try to tease the maximum difference between the impurity and the targets.
All right, and we'll jump in with just one more question, which is, do you have analytics to identify empty LNPs and mRNA encapsulated LNPs?
That's a super interesting question, and we certainly can identify encapsulated RNA from free RNA. Whether we can actually identify an empty LNP capsule is a matter of debate, and I've not yet seen convincing data that anyone would have done that yet. Feel free to reach out and we can look into this. We have certainly shown very good separation in the AAV world, where you have empty and full capsids, but those are protein-based capsids, and you can completely nicely separate out empty from full capsids. For LNPs, I'm not sure that the mechanism is the same, so that you would have an appreciable amount of fully formed empty LNPs, but I would be glad to be convinced otherwise.
All right, well, this is all the time we have for today. We'll address all the other remaining questions by email. So I would like to thank again everyone for joining this webinar. And thank you, Rok Sekirnik, for sharing the Sartorius mRNA experience with us. I wish everyone a fantastic rest of the day.
Thank you, bye-bye.